Well, joining me now is Labour's Shadow Schools Minister, Stephen Morgan. Hi. Let's start with whether you would release all your WhatsApp messages.
Well, they'd be pretty boring, to be honest, Kay.
But would you do it?
Would you?
No.
Well, I think...
End-to-end encryption. You know, if people are talking to you privately, I'm sure there's some data protection rules that have been broken there.
I mean, call me old-fashioned, but I think you should govern the country via meetings with civil servants in the room with minutes of meetings. I think this is about him promoting his book.
Is it not a breach of trust?
Absolutely. But, I mean, it's not the first time that the government have breached the trust of the British people, is it? So I think lessons have got to be learned. And Keir is right to raise with the Prime Minister that we need to bring forward the COVID inquiry so lessons can be learned for the future.
I'm not sure about promoting his book. I think it sold 4,000 in the first 2 weeks. But, you know, that's perhaps a conversation for when Mr Hancock, as and when he wants to come on the show. What about, though, the criticism, and some of the content we'll go through, the criticism of teachers who don't want to work?
The teaching profession is at crisis point. We've got a real issue around recruitment and retention of our teachers. The number of teachers that are leaving the profession is now higher than those that are joining the profession. Vacancies are up 246%. I think the stuff that we've seen in these WhatsApp messages is a real kick in the teeth for teachers across our country.
It looks as though the then Education Secretary thought that teachers would enjoy not being at school.
Gavin Williamson's never been known for his wisdom, to be honest with you.
Certainly not his tact.
You know, look at the U-turns, look at the failures around exams, look at the last-minute guidance that was issued to schools. I have huge respect for our teachers and our school support staff up and down the country. They make a huge difference to children's lives. And I think we deserve a government that gives them the respect and trust that they deserve. Something
that the messages seemed to tell us was that Labour, we know that Labour supported masks in school corridors during the pandemic, but it was a bit, you know, touch and go. It looked as though Chris Whitty at the time didn't think it was, you know, one way or the other. It didn't actually make a big difference.
Labour was always really clear that we should follow the public health guidance available at the time and follow the science. So lessons have got to be learned.
It shouldn't have been.
Well, that's right.
It didn't matter either way.
And I think that's why the inquiry is so important, because we've, you know, it's taken a year for the terms of reference to come forward. Formal hearings haven't heard. Lessons have got to be learned from the past to inform any future response to the pandemic.
But it seemed that they decided that masks should be worn in schools to avoid a fight with Nicola Sturgeon's government. I mean, little ones, kids, wearing masks and all of the challenges that that created for them so that we wouldn't get into a fight with Nicola Sturgeon. And Labour supported that.
As I said, we always wanted to support decisions that were based on evidence and based on the public health.
But did you ask for the evidence? Because the evidence wasn't there, according to this.
Well, I think what we've seen, of course, is that the Prime Minister was more worried about keeping the SNP happy than actually making decisions that were right for the classroom and right for parents and for teachers. So,
but shouldn't Labour have pushed harder to try and get the evidence before backing a decision?
Well, I think we did. I think we used every opportunity available, but of course we're in opposition and it's really difficult to get information out there, especially during a pandemic. But we certainly were asking all the right questions at the time, and always there will be lessons to be learned. But ultimately, we needed to make sure that decisions were being made based on the evidence available to us at the time.
How surprised are you to learn now that actually the Health Secretary wanted schools to be closed and the Education Secretary did not want schools to be closed? I mean, that was a massive decision for kids at the time. As a result, they had online learning for months.
And the consequences of that were significant disruption to children's lives. And the government have not done anywhere near enough to recover children from that pandemic. And we had Sir Kevin Collins, who gave advice to schools to say this is what needed to go into recovery, and the government didn't do anywhere near enough to address those issues.
But should Labour have pushed harder to find out the facts, the science, as you were saying? You're basing your decisions on the science.
I do think we did. You know, these things are always really difficult, but clearly what we've learned is that the government weren't following the advice available to them.
So looking back, do you think that Labour would have thought twice about suggesting that supporting the idea that children should be wearing masks in corridors?
Parents teachers, unions wanted to make sure that the welfare and the well-being of young people was the priority of this government. So I think they will be really upset by what they are seeing in the WhatsApp messages. Lessons have got to be learnt. The government weren't prepared for the pandemic. The consequences of that was the chaos that we saw from Gavin Williamson as the Secretary of State at the time. But
do you think that, given what we know now, Labour would not have supported mask wearing in corridors?
I think it's really difficult to say, Kay. Lessons have got to be learned, and what we need to make sure is that policy is based on the evidence available at the time.
But the evidence available at the time suggested that it was neither here nor there, and yet you supported it.
Well, that was the information we were given at the time.
OK. Talk to me about stuff that's happening now. We're on the final day of 3 days of teachers' strikes today. We've got more strikes coming up as well. What more does Gillian Keegan, the Education Secretary, need to do to try to sort this out?
Well, the responsibility for these strikes and the disruption it's causing to children's lives and parents is a responsibility of this government. And Gillian Keegan has not done enough, in my opinion, to sit round in a room with the teaching unions to negotiate a deal. Labour would have done that months ago. The government were warned months ago that strike action was likely.
And they were on holiday.
A half an hour meeting. I mean, I think that's tokenistic window dressing. Teachers are burnt out, they're overworked, they feel really undervalued by this government. The least the Secretary of State could do is to get the trade unions in a room, lock the door and negotiate a deal that works for the country.
And what should that look like?
Well, it's not for me to say what the figure should be, but what I would want to see is that the ministers do sit round the room with the information available to them and find a deal that works for teachers. It's got to be a fair deal. We've seen that teachers are seeing their pay reduce in real terms by 5%. They are really struggling with the cost of living crisis. People are leaving the profession in their droves. We need a fair
I know, it's 2 o'clock in the morning.
And we also need to see the right conditions in the classroom again.
OK, it's good to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Much appreciated.